I married a man I had never spoken to, based on 12 letters and a photograph I kept pressed inside my Bible. And it took me nearly 4 months of living under his roof to understand that. I had fallen in love with the wrong brother's handwriting. I did not know that yet. Standing on the platform at Cheyenne with my trunk at my feet and the wind pulling strands loose from my hair, I only knew that the man walking toward me did not move like his letters sounded. His letters had been careful. He was not careful. He crossed the platform in 4 long strides, looked at me the way a man looks at a horse he is deciding whether to buy, and said, "You're smaller than I pictured." That was the first sentence Wyatt Calloway ever spoke to me, and it did not sound like a single word he had written. We were married that same afternoon by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through. In the front room of the ranch house with dust still on my traveling boots, when the preacher asked if there was anyone present who spoke for either party, Daniel, standing near the cold hearth with his hat in his hands, opened his mouth as though he meant to say something, and for one long moment the whole room waited on whatever it was. Then he only said, "No objection," in a voice gone strangely thick, and looked hard at the floorboards until the preacher moved on to the vows. I did not think anything of it then. I only remember that Wyatt's hand, when he took mine, was rougher than I expected and did not shake at all, and that somewhere behind us, a chair scraped back across the floor as though someone had risen halfway, and then thought better of it. I had left everything behind to hear those words in person. 3 months earlier, my younger sister had married the man I had been promised to since I was 17, and my mother, God rest her, had died believing I would be provided for by a man who instead stood beside my sister at the altar and would not meet my eyes. There was no home left for me in Springfield after that. There was only shame, and a room in my aunt's house that grew smaller every week. I stayed in it, and finally, an advertisement in the back pages of the matrimonial news that read like a small miracle. Rancher, 32, Wyoming Territory, seeks a wife of good character and steady hand. 12 letters passed between us over 2 years before I agreed to come. If this marriage failed, I would not simply be returning home. I would be returning to nothing, because there was no home left to return to, and every soul in Springfield already believed the worst of me. Each of those 12 letters took the better part of 3 weeks to reach me, carried first by stagecoach and then, for the last leg, aboard freight cars newly laid along the Union Pacific line, before continuing on horseback to a ranch that still had no post office of its own. 2 years passed between the first letter and the day I finally boarded the train west. And in all that waiting, I built the man on the page into someone larger than any single person could ever be, because I had nothing but paper and patience to build him from. The letters had told me he loved the smell of rain before it reached the ground. They told me he had planted a row of larkspur along the porch, because his mother had loved the color blue and he wanted something blue near the house when I arrived. They told me that some nights the quiet of the ranch pressed so heavy against him that he would sit outside until the stars came out just to remind himself the world was still large. I had read that letter so many times, the fold had worn soft as cloth. I had imagined a man who noticed the color of the sky. I had not imagined a man who, upon lifting my trunk into the wagon, said only, "Careful, that corner catches," and then said nothing at all for 11 miles. The ranch itself was larger than I had pictured. A good stretch of land Wyatt had claimed under the Homestead Act some years before, 160 acres he had proved up by breaking sod and building, fenced until the government made the claim legal and permanent. The land office in Cheyenne had required 2 neighbors willing to swear before a clerk that he had lived on the claim and worked it honestly, and Wyatt had ridden 40 miles round trip twice a year for 5 years running just to keep that promise current on paper. There was a main house of hewn logs, a barn newly reshingled, and behind the house, half finished, a small addition of raw pine lumber that still smelled of sawdust. Wyatt told me this was to be my sewing room, though he said it the way a man reports on a fence line, flat and factual, nothing in his voice matching the tenderness of the letter that had described 3 months earlier how he lay awake, imagining what small comforts might make a wife feel less far from home. The Saturday after I arrived, Wyatt drove me into the town nearest the ranch, a cluster of clapboard buildings that had not existed. The storekeeper told me proudly, more than 4 years earlier, flour sold for 4 cents a pound behind that counter. And the storekeeper's wife looked me over the way women in small towns always look over a stranger claimed by one of their own. Taking my measure before deciding whether to be kind, she told me, unprompted, that Wyatt Calloway paid his hands fair wages, $30 a month, same as any outfit twice his size, and kept his word on every debt in the ledger book she kept behind the counter. I understood, standing there, that the town already knew things about my husband's character that I had only guessed at from letters, and that his silence, whatever else it meant, had never once meant unkindness. That autumn, the town held its harvest dance in the loft above the feed store, lanterns strung between the rafters and a fiddler sawing out reels older than any of us. Wyatt danced the way he did everything else, competent and unadorned, his hands steady at my waist, and I found myself searching his face for some flicker of the man who had written about larkspur and rain, and finding instead only careful concentration on the steps. It was Daniel who stood near the punch table all evening, not dancing, watching the room the way a man watches something he has decided is not his to touch. Later I would learn that some of the older hands at that dance had ridden up from Texas only 2 summers before, part of a drive that had pushed cattle 1,000 miles north to the rail yards at Abilene over 3 long months, and that they spoke of Wyatt with the plain respect men, save for someone who has never once cheated them on a wage. I filed that respect away the same place I filed the flower prices and the 4-year-old town evidence of a good man, gathered from everyone except the man himself. I think often now of the 9th letter, the one where I had finally worked up the courage to ask a question. No proper correspondence. Courtship required me to ask whether he had ever loved anyone before me, and if so, what had become of it. The answer came back 3 weeks later, careful and slow, admitting to a girl in Missouri he had courted at 19 who had chosen a banker's son instead, and confessing that the rejection had taught him to guard his heart the way a man guards a well in dry country, sparingly, and only for those who proved they would not waste it. I had read that letter on the train itself, somewhere past the Missouri line, and I had pressed my hand flat against the page as though I could feel through the paper the same guardedness he described, thinking I understood exactly the kind of man I was traveling toward. I did not know, reading it, that the hand that had guarded that memory so carefully was not the hand that would meet me at the station. I only knew that whoever had written those words had been hurt once in a way that made him careful, and I had decided, somewhere over those long miles of prairie, that carefulness was a kind of promise I could live inside. It was Daniel who had built that room. I did not know that yet either. Daniel was Wyatt's younger brother by 6 years, a quiet man who kept the ranch ledgers and read by lamplight long after the rest of the house had gone dark. He had pale eyes, the color of creek water in November, and a permanent smudge of ink along the side of his right hand that no washing ever fully lifted. In those first weeks he said almost nothing to me directly. He passed the salt at supper. He nodded when I thanked him for mending the hinge on the sewing room door. He was, I thought, simply a shy man living in his brother's shadow, and I gave him no more thought than that, because I had married Wyatt, and it was Wyatt's voice I was straining to hear inside the man across the table from me, and not finding. I want to tell you plainly what those first weeks were like, because I think you deserve the truth even where it does not flatter me. I was disappointed, and I was ashamed of being disappointed, because a woman who crosses 600 miles for a stranger has no right to expect poetry over breakfast. Wyatt was not unkind. He rose before dawn, and worked until the light failed and never once raised his voice to me. He fixed the loose step at the kitchen door the same week I mentioned it, without being asked twice. But when I quoted back to him, one evening, a line from his own letter, the one about the rain, about how he loved the smell of it coming before it arrived, he went very still, and something crossed his face that I mistook, at the time, for embarrassment at being sentimental. "Did I write that?" he said, not quite a question, and turned back to his plate. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself that a man's hands and his patience were worth more than his handwriting, and some mornings I believed it. Other mornings, hanging wash on the line while the mountains sat blue and enormous against the sky, I found myself homesick not for Springfield, which had given me nothing, but for the man who had written to me, a man I now understood I might never actually meet, because he did not seem to live inside the man I had married. That was the open wound I carried through those first months, though I did not yet have a name to put to what was missing. I only knew that when Wyatt spoke, I kept listening for an echo that never came. It was our nearest neighbor's wife, a weathered woman who had ridden 2 hours each way just to bring a jar of chokecherry preserves and take my measure properly, who first said something that lodged itself in me like a splinter I could not find to pull out. She told me, over coffee at my own kitchen table, that she remembered when Wyatt Calloway had first placed his advertisement in the Matrimonial News, because Daniel had ridden into town that same week to post it himself, and had stood at the counter a long while, she said, reading it over twice before he handed it across, as though he were the one sending it and not merely the one delivering it. She meant nothing by the telling, it was simply neighborly gossip, offered the way women offer preserves, a small gift meant to fill a quiet afternoon, but I turned it over for days afterward. The picture of Daniel standing at that counter, reading his own brother's advertisement twice before letting it go, and I told myself it meant nothing at all, the same way I told myself so many things that autumn that I did not yet have the courage to examine closely, the sensory detail. I remember most from that season is the smell of the ledger room at night, beeswax candle, old paper, the particular must of ink gone slightly dry in its well, because that was where I found the page that changed everything. I had gone looking for a spare quilt in the cedar chest beside the ledger desk, and my hand, reaching past folded linens, closed instead around a loose sheet of paper, half a letter, unfinished, unsent. The hand that had written it was familiar to me in a way that stopped my breath, because I had read that hand a dozen times before, folded inside my Bible, memorized past all reason. But this page was signed with no name at all, only a line crossed out and rewritten 3 times, as though the writer could not decide how much of himself to give away. I have never told anyone this, but some nights I imagine what it would be to have someone worth writing to. I stood in that cold room with the candle guttering and understood, all at once and with a clarity that felt like falling, that the tender hand behind every letter I had crossed 600 miles to meet belonged not to my husband, but to his brother. I did not sleep that night. I lay beside a man whose warmth I had grown used to and whose silence I no longer knew how to read. And I turned the discovery over and over, looking for some innocent explanation that would let me keep believing what I had built my whole crossing upon. Perhaps Daniel had merely helped with a word here, a phrase there. Perhaps Wyatt had dictated his heart, and Daniel had only dressed it in better clothes. I wanted, badly, for that to be true, because the alternative was a grief I did not yet have room for, that I had married one brother's hands and fallen for another brother's heart. And neither man had thought to tell me which parts of the courtship had been real. I thought of my sister's wedding, which I had not attended, and of the note she left instead of a conversation, 3 lines explaining that love, in the end, does not wait patiently at doorsteps for permission. I had crossed 600 miles believing I was escaping a family built on comfortable silences and small deceptions, only to find myself lying awake in a different house built on the very same foundation. The irony of it did not comfort me. It only sharpened the ache. The next morning, I found Daniel alone in the barn, currying the sorrel mare with the long, unhurried strokes of a man who does his best thinking with his hands occupied. I asked him, before I had decided whether I truly wanted the answer, whether he had ever helped his brother with correspondence. He went still, in the exact way Wyatt had gone still over the rain letter, and I understood then that stillness ran in that family like a shared inheritance. Some, he said, and would not look at me. I asked him how much was some. He set down the curry comb very carefully, as though it might break, and said, "Mrs. Calloway, I think you already know the answer, or you wouldn't be asking it in the barn instead of the kitchen." He was right. I had chosen the barn because I did not want Wyatt to hear how the question landed. I asked him why. Daniel's jaw worked once before he spoke, and when he finally did, his voice had none of the guarded flatness I had grown used to at his brother's table. Wyatt asked me to help him write one letter, he said, because he never learned his letters proper as a boy. There was no school within 20 miles of where we were raised, and by the time there was, he was old enough to be ashamed of sitting in it. 1 letter turned into 2. 2 turned into 12. I told myself each time that I was only helping my brother say what he already felt. I don't know anymore if that was ever entirely true. He looked at me then, finally, and there was something in his face I had spent 2 years hoping to find in Wyatt's. Not eloquence, exactly, but a kind of naked honesty that had nowhere left to hide. "I should have stopped," he said. "I didn't want to." And then, as though he heard how that sounded, he turned back to the mare and said nothing more. And I understood that he had come right up to the edge of a confession and pulled himself back from it, the way a man pulls his hand from a stove before he's fully burned. I walked back to the house with the sun already hard overhead and the smell of dust and horse still clinging to my sleeves, and I found Wyatt on the porch, oiling a bridle with the same patient, unhurried hands that had lifted my trunk 11 miles of silence ago. I did not ease into it. I told him what I had found in the cedar chest, and I watched 12 months of careful composure leave his face all at once, the way water leaves a cracked jar. He did not deny it. He set the bridle down very precisely on the porch rail, as though precision might hold something else together, and he told me, in a voice scraped raw of all its usual flatness, that he had never learned to read past his own name, and a handful of words scratched from the Bible his mother kept, that his father had needed him breaking horses at 11 years old instead of sitting at a slate, and that when the advertisement came back with my first letter, a letter full of careful sentences he could not fully make out, shame had done what shame always does, which is convince a man that the truth would cost him more than the lie ever could. "I wanted you to come," he said. "I wanted it so much I let my brother be the man I couldn't be on paper. I am not proud of it, but I have not lied to you with my hands, Josephine, only with the ink. I want to be honest and tell you that in that moment I did not feel forgiveness. I felt the old wound from Springfield tear open fresh, because it was the same wound in a different coat, a man's truth arriving too late to spare me, the humiliation of having believed something false. I went inside and I took my trunk down from the shelf in the sewing room Daniel had built with his own hands, and I began, mechanically, to fold the 2 dresses I had brought west, thinking of the eastbound train that left Cheyenne on Thursdays, thinking that I would rather arrive nowhere than keep living inside a lie 2 men had built for me out of love and cowardice in equal measure. Before I began folding my second dress, I took down the small tin-framed photograph Wyatt had sent with his 9th letter, the one I had kept propped against the washstand mirror every morning since Cheyenne, and I held it a long while under the gray afternoon light. It was, undeniably, his face in that photograph, the same stubbled jaw, the same deep-set eyes, and yet I found myself searching it now for something I had never thought to look for before. Some sign in the set of his mouth that would tell me which parts of the man I had married had always been separate from the words that had convinced me to come. I found no such sign. A photograph, I understood then, could only ever show a man's face, never the hand that had guided the pen describing what lay behind it, and I set the frame down harder than I meant to, so that the little glass pane inside it cracked clean across one corner, and I did not have it in me, that afternoon, to feel sorry for the damage. It was Daniel who stopped me. Standing in the doorway of the room he had framed and planed and sanded smooth through 3 winters of quiet evenings. And what he said was not a defense of his brother, nor an apology for himself. He said, "Before you decide anything, come look at the room." I did not want to, but something in his face, that same naked honesty from the barn, made me follow him down the hall to the little addition still smelling faintly of pine, and he pointed, without a word, to the underside of the window ledge, where Wyatt had carved, crookedly, in a boy's uneven letters clearly copied one stroke at a time from somewhere, the words for Josephine, so she knows the blue was for her too. It had taken him, Daniel said quietly, the better part of a week to trace those 11 letters correctly, practicing on scrap wood first, so the mistakes wouldn't show on the ledge itself. "That's not ink," Daniel said. "That's his hand. He wanted you to have one thing that was only his, even if he had to teach himself the whole alphabet again to leave it for you." And then, so quiet I almost missed it beneath the sound of the wind working at the shingles, he added, "I have loved you a little since the 3rd letter, and I have hated myself for it since the 4th, because none of it was ever mine to feel. But that carving is his. Don't mistake the 2 of us for each other twice." I stood with my hand against that rough, uneven word for a long time. I thought of my sister and the man who had promised me his whole life and then given it silently to someone else, without the decency of telling me himself. And I understood, for the first time since Cheyenne, that the wound I carried had never truly been about pretty language at all. It had been about being lied to without warning, left to discover the truth alone, in a room, by accident. Wyatt had lied to me, but he had also spent a week teaching his own clumsy hand to carve 11 letters into pine so that some part of this house would speak for him without his brother's borrowed grace. That was not nothing. It was, I thought, very possibly everything. I found Wyatt still on the porch where I had left him, the bridle abandoned now, his hat off, turning it slowly in his hands, the way a man turns something when he has run out of other things to hold on to. I did not tell him I forgave him, because I did not yet know if that was true. I told him instead that I had seen the ledge, and I watched him flinch, as though I had struck a wound rawer than the one I had found in the cedar chest. "I did not want you reading that either," he said. "I wanted it to just be there, quiet, the way I am." I sat down beside him on the step, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, and I asked him to read me something. Anything, right there, badly if he had to. He looked at me a long moment, and something in his face broke open the way the porch boards give a little under new weight, and he reached into his coat and drew out a single scrap of paper I recognized as the 7th letter, the one about the larkspur, and he read it to me himself, haltingly, sounding out words he had clearly never fully understood before that moment, his voice catching on his own brother's borrowed sentences until they stopped being borrowed at all and became slowly, painfully, his. I would learn, only later, from Daniel, that some nights, that whole first year, long after I had gone to sleep, Wyatt had taken the ledger book out to the barn by lantern light and traced his own name over and over on scrap paper until his hand stopped shaking around the letters, practicing in secret the same way a much younger boy might have, ashamed even in an empty barn of being seen failing at something so many others managed before the age of 6. The larkspur Wyatt had planted that first spring came up taller than either of us expected, a ragged blue line along the porch that the wind bent flat some mornings and stood upright again by noon. I took to cutting a few stems for the kitchen table each week, not because the house needed flowers, but because I had come to understand that blue had never really been about his mother at all. It had been the one true thing he knew how to say without borrowing anyone's hand for it, planted in dirt instead of ink, where he trusted his own hands completely. Daniel left for a schoolhouse post in Laramie before the first snow that year, a position he had quietly written away 4 weeks earlier. Before any of this had come apart in the cedar chest, he did not say goodbye to me alone, and I understood why, and I let him have that mercy. Wyatt still cannot read a full page without his finger tracing beneath the words, slow as a man walking an unfamiliar fence line in the dark. But some evenings now he reads to me anyway, badly and without shame, and I have come to think that a man's stumbling voice, reading true, is worth more than any stranger's borrowed poetry ever was. He wrote to me once that first winter from Laramie, a short, careful letter in his own hand and no one else's, telling me only that the schoolhouse had 31 pupils and a stove that smoked when the wind came from the north, and that he hoped the larkspur had come up well in spring. He did not sign it with anything more than his name, and I understood that to be its own kind of gift, a letter, finally, that asked nothing of me and pretended nothing about itself. I wrote back once, just as plainly, and told him the larkspur had indeed come up, taller than either Wyatt or I had expected, and that Wyatt had built a second row of shelving in the schoolroom addition, which was no longer a sewing room at all but a proper nursery, though I did not yet tell him why. We did not correspond again after that, not out of anger, but because some doors close more kindly when they are shut all the way, and I think we both understood that this one had earned the right to close gently. He never carved anything else into that house. He never needed to. Some nights I still run my thumb along those 11 crooked letters under the window ledge before I blow out the lamp, And I think that a lie told out of shame and a truth carved out of love can live in the same house, in the same wood, if a man is willing to spend the rest of his life making up the difference.